I paid for my sister's education while working 2 jobs, only to have her call me a loser at a family dinner. She was shocked when I stopped paying her rent and told everyone why she could no longer afford her lifestyle. When Lauren received her acceptance letter to the college she had dreamed about since high school, my parents celebrated as if she had already graduated. Mom cried. Dad opened a bottle of wine he had been saving. Lauren walked around the house, talking about internships, careers, cities she might live in, and how everything was finally beginning for her. I was happy for her. I really was. But while everyone else was celebrating, I was doing the math in my head because my parents had already admitted they couldn't afford tuition and living expenses. It didn't take long before the hints started. Mom would mention the cost of textbooks while looking directly at me. Dad would talk about how older siblings were supposed to help younger ones get ahead. Nobody officially asked me to become Lauren's financial support system. They simply behaved as though I had already agreed. At the time, I worked full-time as a mechanic. I wasn't rich, but I was careful. I had been saving toward a down payment on a small house, and for the first time in years, the goal seemed reachable. Helping Lauren with a few expenses didn't sound dangerous. I paid for textbooks 1 month, groceries the next. Then Lauren called because her rent was short. After that came electricity, internet, another rent payment, then money because she was supposedly too stressed from exams to worry about finances. Every request, somehow, graduation became the magical date when every sacrifice would suddenly make sense. Within a year, I had taken a second job. I worked evenings and weekends whenever I could. My savings stopped growing, then began shrinking. I stopped looking at houses because scrolling through listings only reminded me of what I had delayed. Meanwhile, Lauren's social media looked like the life of someone who had never worried about money once. There were expensive restaurants, new shoes, weekend trips, handbags I would never have bought for myself. I remember staring at one photo of her holding a cocktail beside 3 friends at some rooftop restaurant and wondering whether I had worked an extra Saturday so she could take that picture. When I finally asked her where the money for everything was coming from, she barely reacted. "Everyone dresses like this here," she said. "I can't walk around looking broke." I told her there was a difference between looking broke and spending money she didn't have. She laughed, like I was being dramatic. Mom was worse when I brought it up. "Lauren is trying to build connections," she told me. "College isn't only classes." Dad gave me his favorite line. "Family takes care of family." Somehow that sentence always meant I should sacrifice something, and Lauren should receive it. Lauren stopped asking how I was doing. Our conversations became financial transactions disguised as sisterly phone calls. She complained about professors, roommates, cafeteria, coffee, parties she might miss, clothes she supposedly needed. She never asked whether I was sleeping enough or why I sounded exhausted. One night, after 14 hours between both jobs, I sat alone in my car eating crackers because I hadn't packed dinner. My phone buzzed. Lauren needed another $100 because some friends were going out and she didn't want to be the only one staying behind. I sent it. Then I sat there looking at the confirmation screen, wondering when helping my sister had turned into disappearing from my own life. The first time I seriously considered saying no came when she announced she wanted to study abroad. She didn't ask whether it was possible. She called me excitedly and started describing the program as if the decision had already been made. "It costs a little more," she said casually, "but I'll probably never get another chance like this." I asked how much "a little more" meant. When she gave me the number, I actually thought she was joking. I told her I was already stretched beyond what I could manage. There was a pause, and then she said, "You always figure something out." That sentence stayed with me. You always figure something out. As though my exhaustion were a resource the family could withdraw whenever they needed it. I called my parents hoping, stupidly, that this would finally be the request they considered unreasonable. Instead, Mom sounded delighted. "Think how good this could be for her future." Dad said I had always been dependable and would find a way. Neither asked what finding a way would cost me. When I hung up, One of my coworkers noticed my expression and asked what happened. I explained more than I intended. When I finished, she stared at me and said, "Claire, they don't appreciate you. They expect you." I wanted to defend my family, but I couldn't think of anything to say. A few weeks later, my parents invited me to dinner while Lauren was home from school. From the moment I arrived, everything revolved around her. Mom asked about classes, Dad asked about internships. They wanted to hear every detail of the study abroad program. I sat there eating while nobody asked a single question about my work or my life. Then Lauren smiled across the table and said, "Hope you're ready for some extra shifts, big sister. Europe isn't cheap." She said it like a joke. Everyone heard it. I put my fork down. "Maybe you should get a part-time job," Lauren laughed. Not awkwardly, genuinely laughed. "Me? I'm already busy with school." Something inside me finally moved. "So, am I supposed to keep paying forever?" Her smile disappeared. Mom immediately told me not to start an argument. Lauren leaned back and stared at me with open irritation. "What is your problem lately?" "My problem is that I'm working 2 jobs to fund a lifestyle you pretend is yours." The room went quiet. Lauren's expression hardened. "You've always been bitter. Just because your life isn't going anywhere doesn't mean you should punish me because mine is." For a second, I couldn't speak. I had imagined dozens of reasons for Lauren's behavior over the years. Immaturity, stress, selfishness. I had never imagined that she actually looked down on me. "My life isn't going anywhere," I said slowly, "because I've been financing yours." Mom snapped my name like a warning. Dad told me I was being inappropriate. Then Mom said the sentence that ended whatever obligation I still felt. "You're her big sister. Supporting her is part of your responsibility." I looked at all 3 of them, and suddenly everything seemed embarrassingly obvious. They weren't grateful because they didn't believe I had given them anything. In their minds, my money, time, weekends, savings, and future already belonged to the family. I stood up. Lauren rolled her eyes. "Here comes the martyr act." "No," I said. "Actually, this is the last payment." Her face changed. "No more rent. No utilities. No tuition. No study abroad. Nothing." Lauren went pale. "You can't do that." "I already did. How am I supposed to live?" I picked up my jacket. "The same way I've been living for years. You figure something out." Then I walked out before any of them could stop me. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I expected guilt to hit me. Instead, for the first time in years, I felt relief. I also knew my family well enough to understand one thing. They were not going to let me leave quietly. By the next morning, my phone looked like it had been attacked. Lauren had called 9 times before 7:30, then switched to messages when she realized I wasn't going to answer. The first few were angry. "Thanks for ruining dinner. Hope you're proud of yourself. You really showed everyone what kind of person you are." When I ignored those, the tone changed. Suddenly she was frightened. "Claire, seriously, what am I supposed to do about rent?" Then came the guilt. I can't believe my own sister would abandon me like this. I read every message and responded to none of them. For years, every financial emergency had become mine, the second Lauren mentioned it. This time I forced myself to sit with the discomfort and do nothing. It felt unnatural, almost cruel, until I reminded myself that Lauren was 22 years old, healthy, capable, and surrounded by 2 parents who had spent years telling me how important family support was. If they believed that so strongly, they could finally practice it themselves. Mom called before lunch. She didn't even say hello. "I don't know what has gotten into you." Her voice had that familiar, disappointed edge designed to make me feel 12 years old again. She said Lauren hadn't slept, that she was panicking about school, and that I was creating unnecessary stress during an important point in her education. "She needs stability," Mom insisted. I almost laughed. So did I. There was silence. I told her I had spent years giving up stability so Lauren wouldn't have to experience inconvenience. Mom immediately returned to the family argument. She's your sister. I told her that being someone's sister did not make me legally or morally responsible for every bill they refused to pay themselves. Dad called later and was less subtle. He said I was selfish, vindictive, and punishing Lauren because I was jealous of her opportunities. That one actually hurt, mostly because I realized Lauren had already started rewriting what happened at dinner. In their version, I wasn't exhausted or exploited. I was resentful of the successful younger sister. The first concrete consequence arrived 4 days later when Lauren's landlord called me. Apparently, my number had been listed as an emergency financial contact because I was the person who had consistently transferred the rent. He was polite, but confused. The payment hadn't arrived, and Lauren had apparently told him there had been a banking issue. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. Even after everything, she still expected me to quietly fix it. There isn't a banking issue, I told him. I'm no longer paying her rent. You'll need to speak with Lauren directly. He hesitated, then thanked me. The entire call lasted less than 2 minutes, but when it ended, I sat staring at my phone. I knew that conversation had just made the situation real for her. Until then, she probably believed I was having a tantrum and would eventually cave. Now there was an actual due date attached to my decision. 3 evenings later, someone started pounding on my apartment door. When I looked through the peephole, Lauren was standing in the hallway. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot, her face was bare, and for the first time in years she didn't look polished or superior. She looked scared. I opened the door but didn't invite her inside. You need to fix this, she said immediately. Not hello. Not I'm sorry. Not can we talk. Fix this. I leaned against the frame. Fix what? Her eyes widened as if I was being deliberately stupid. My rent. My landlord called me. If I don't pay, I could lose the apartment. I nodded once. Then you should talk to your landlord. She stared at me. Claire, stop. This isn't funny. I told her I wasn't laughing. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. I can't move back home. Mom and Dad barely have space. I have classes. I have exams. I can't deal with this right now. I heard the same assumption underneath every sentence. Her problems were emergencies. Mine were background noise. Lauren, I worked 2 jobs for years because you didn't want to deal with this. She flinched. I kept going. I paid for your apartment, your food, your utilities, your nights out. I delayed buying a home. I drained savings. I picked up shifts when I was sick. And at dinner, when I finally questioned one more expense, you told me my life was going nowhere. Her face tightened. I was angry. No, I said. You were comfortable. You said what you actually believed because you never thought there would be consequences. She shook her head quickly. I didn't mean it like that. I almost smiled at how familiar that sentence sounded. Then how did you mean it? That was when the tears started. Not quiet tears. Full, dramatic sobs that probably would have broken me 6 months earlier. Lauren covered her face and said she was overwhelmed, that college was harder than I understood, that she had pressure from everyone around her, that she had only bought certain things because she didn't want to feel like an outsider. I listened without interrupting. Then she reached for my arm and said, Please, Claire, just help me until the end of the semester. I'll change. I promise. I wanted to believe her. She was still my little sister, and there was a part of me that remembered helping her with homework when we were kids and driving her to school when she missed the bus. But another part of me finally understood the difference between helping someone and protecting them from adulthood. Get a job, I said. Sell some of the things you bought. Talk to your school about assistance. Move somewhere cheaper. Make a budget. Her crying stopped almost instantly. You're serious? Completely. Her expression turned hard again. You're being cruel. I told her cruelty would have been watching someone I loved destroy herself while pretending everything was fine. She snapped that family was supposed to help each other. Family supports each other, I said. They don't drain one person and then insult her for being tired. She opened her mouth to argue, but I was finished. You wanted me to stop acting like a martyr. Fine. I'm not sacrificing myself anymore. Then I closed the door. I stood behind it afterward, listening to her footsteps disappear down the hallway, and waited for the guilt to crush me. It came, but it didn't win. The campaign against me began almost immediately. Mom started calling relatives. Dad told one of my uncles that I had cut Lauren off without warning. Lauren posted vague messages online about learning who really cared about you when life became difficult. Then she created a fundraiser. I found out because a cousin sent me the link with the message, "Is this about you?" Lauren had written that she had been unexpectedly abandoned by a source of financial support and might lose housing during the semester. She didn't mention that the financial support was her sister. She definitely didn't mention the years of designer purchases, restaurants, trips, or the study abroad program she expected me to finance. The comments were full of sympathy at first. Her friends wrote things like, "You don't deserve this," and "Some people are so selfish." I stared at the page for a long time, then closed it. I refused to defend myself publicly. I had spent too many years trying to prove my value to people who benefited from pretending not to see it. That silence irritated my parents more than anything. They wanted an argument they could win. Instead, I simply stopped participating. When Mom said I was tearing the family apart, I answered, "No." I stopped holding it together by myself. When Dad called me ungrateful for everything they had supposedly done for me, I reminded him that I had never asked them to fund my adult life. The calls became shorter after that. What surprised me most was what happened when other relatives began asking questions. My aunt called ready to lecture me, but after I explained that I had paid Lauren's rent, utilities, food, tuition expenses, and personal spending for years while working 2 jobs, her tone changed completely. "Wait," she said. "She expected you to keep paying after she said that to you?" "Apparently." My aunt went quiet. That was the first time someone in the family sounded shocked on my behalf. Within weeks, Lauren's version of events started falling apart. The fundraiser barely moved after the initial attention. A few people donated small amounts, but nowhere near what she needed. Friends who had been sympathetic stopped responding when she began asking them directly for money. According to someone we both knew, Lauren complained constantly that nobody understood how difficult her situation was. She still refused to find steady work. She kept insisting she was too busy with classes, though somehow she still found time to post photos from cafes and complain that life had become unfair. Eventually, the inevitable happened. She lost the apartment and moved back into my parents' house. I learned about it from a friend, not from my family. Apparently, Lauren had packed everything into my parents' spare room and immediately started complaining about the food, the lack of privacy, and how far the house was from campus. My friend laughed while telling me that Lauren had actually said, "Claire never made me live like this." Hearing my name used that way should have made me angry. Instead, it clarified everything. Lauren didn't miss me. She missed what I provided. And Mom and Dad, rather than finally setting boundaries, began spending their own savings to recreate as much of her old lifestyle as possible. They bought groceries she liked, paid transportation costs, covered school expenses, and defended her whenever anyone suggested she get a job. For the first time, I watched the family system operate without me inside it. The pressure didn't disappear. It simply moved to the next available people. My parents had spent years insisting Lauren's needs were reasonable because I was the one paying for them. Now they were the ones opening their wallets, and I suspected reality was finally becoming harder to ignore. I didn't know yet how bad it would get, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Lauren had never learned where the money came from because someone had always rescued her before the consequences arrived. And this time, the people rescuing her were about to discover exactly what that had cost me. For a while, I heard almost nothing from my parents, and that silence told me more than their arguments ever had. Mom had always been the first to call whenever Lauren needed something, and Dad had never hesitated to remind me that family came first. Now, suddenly, they were quiet. I suspected the reason was simple. Supporting Lauren was far easier to defend when the money came from someone else. Once every grocery bill, transportation cost, tuition payment, an emergency landed directly in their laps, the situation probably looked different. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't want them to struggle. But I also refused to rescue them from a problem they had spent years insisting wasn't a problem at all. For the first time since Lauren started college, my paycheck belonged entirely to me. I started rebuilding my savings. I reopened the folder of house listings I had abandoned years earlier. I even took a Saturday off without feeling guilty. And the strangest part was realizing how unfamiliar rest had become. Through relatives and mutual friends, I kept hearing small updates about Lauren. At first, she was still acting as though living with mom and dad was some temporary inconvenience before someone restored her old life. She complained about the commute to campus, complained that mom didn't buy the right groceries, complained that dad expected her to help around the house. One friend told me Lauren had actually said, "I can't focus when everyone keeps asking me to do chores." I almost laughed when I heard that. Apparently, washing dishes was now an obstacle to academic success. Mom and Dad continued making excuses for her, but cracks were beginning to show. Dad started picking up extra hours wherever he could. Mom canceled plans with friends because money was tight. They had spent years watching me do exactly those things without considering it unfair. Yet once they were the ones making sacrifices, suddenly the burden became visible. Lauren's social life deteriorated even faster. The friends who had once surrounded her at restaurants and weekend trips gradually disappeared when there was no longer anyone paying. She kept trying to maintain the appearance that everything was fine, posting old photos or carefully framed pictures that made it look like she was still living the same life. But people knew. Her fundraiser had become an embarrassment, especially after several classmates learned that she had been receiving years of financial support from me while presenting herself as independent. According to a mutual friend, someone asked Lauren directly why she hadn't found a job. Lauren became furious and said people were judging her without understanding the pressure she was under. That answer might have worked on me once. Now I could hear what it really meant. She still believed consequences were something other people should absorb on her behalf. The call from Mom came on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't answer. When I finally did, there was no greeting, only breathing on the other end. Then she said, "Claire, we have a serious problem." Her voice sounded different, smaller, stripped of the authority she usually used with me. I asked what happened. She hesitated before admitting that Lauren had been using one of their credit cards. At first, Mom claimed it was only for school expenses. Then Dad came onto the phone and corrected her. It wasn't school expenses. Lauren had maxed out nearly the entire limit over several months. Clothes, online shopping, restaurants, beauty appointments, electronics, delivery services, hundreds of small purchases that had accumulated into a number my parents couldn't afford. They had only discovered the full amount when the minimum payment jumped, and Dad checked the statement. I sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing while they explained. What shocked me wasn't that Lauren had overspent. It was how familiar every excuse sounded. Mom said Lauren had been stressed. Dad said she hadn't understood how quickly the balance would grow. Mom said she was still young. Dad said maybe the transition from living independently had been harder than they realized. I listened until they ran out of excuses and finally asked, "Why are you telling me?" The silence that followed answered the question before Mom did. "We were hoping you could help us get ahead of the payments." I actually closed my eyes. After everything, after the insults, the accusations, the relatives calling me selfish, the fundraiser, the months of blaming me for Lauren's collapse, they still believed the solution was my bank account. "No," I said. Mom immediately changed tone. "Claire, please, this is different." I asked her how. She said this debt affected them, not just Lauren. I couldn't help it. I laughed once, quietly. "Exactly. Now it affects you." Dad became defensive and told me this wasn't the time to make a point. I told him I wasn't making one. I was enforcing the same boundary I had already explained. "You both chose to keep funding her after I stopped. You defended her. You told everyone I was cruel for refusing to do exactly what you're asking me to do again. Mom said they could lose their financial stability. I answered, I nearly lost mine, and neither of you cared. That ended the argument for several seconds. Dad finally said, So you're just going to let us drown? I hated that question because it was the same trap they had used for years. If I refused to save someone from the consequences of their own choices, then somehow I was responsible for the drowning. No, I said. I'm going to let you handle your finances. There's a difference. I suggested they freeze the card, make Lauren repay what she could, sell unnecessary purchases, and create a payment plan with the bank. Dad muttered that Lauren didn't have enough income. Then she needs income, I replied. Mom sounded exhausted when she said, You really aren't going to help, are you? For once, I didn't explain myself again. No, Mom, I'm not. That was the last major confrontation we had. Maybe something finally clicked for them. Or maybe they simply realized guilt no longer worked on me. I heard later that Dad canceled the card and forced Lauren to return several purchases. She eventually took a part-time job, though according to relatives she complained constantly about it. Mom stopped calling cousins to defend her. The family gossip slowly died because there was no dramatic rescue, no public reconciliation, no moment where I apologized and resumed my old role. Life simply continued, and without me acting as the emergency fund, everyone had to adjust to reality. What surprised me was how quickly my own life began changing once I stopped carrying theirs. Within a year, my savings looked healthier than they had in ages. I reduced my hours at the second job, then finally quit it altogether. The first weekend after my last shift, I woke up Saturday morning and realized I had nowhere I was required to be. I made coffee, sat by the window, and felt something close to grief for all the years I had given away. But underneath that grief was relief. I started looking seriously at houses again. Nothing extravagant, just something small, something mine. When I eventually signed the paperwork on a modest place, I sat alone in the empty living room after the realtor left and cried. Not because the house was perfect, but because I had once convinced myself I might never have it. I had postponed my future so many times for Lauren that choosing myself felt almost revolutionary. As for Lauren, the last reliable update I got was that she was still living with our parents while finishing school more slowly than planned. She had a job now, paid some of her own expenses, and apparently resented every minute of it. Maybe someday she would understand what I had tried to tell her. Maybe she wouldn't. I stopped needing that understanding. My parents never gave me the apology I once thought I deserved either. There was no dramatic phone call where they admitted I had been right all along. But their silence after the credit card disaster was enough. They had finally experienced what it meant to be treated like an endless resource, and there was nothing left for them to say. For years, I believed cutting Lauren off would make me a terrible sister. My family had repeated that idea so often that it became part of how I saw myself. But distance gave me a clearer truth. I hadn't destroyed Lauren's life by refusing to finance it. I had simply stopped hiding the consequences of the way she lived. And I hadn't torn my family apart either. The cracks were already there. I had just been standing in them, holding everything together with money, exhaustion, and guilt. The moment I stepped away, everyone finally had to see what I had been carrying. They made their choices. I made mine. And for the first time in years, my future was no longer something I had to sacrifice so somebody else could have theirs.